When the leather belt cracked against my skin for the third time that night, the sound was louder than the scream that ripped from my throat, and when the fourth blow came down across my shoulder, I heard the sickening snap of bone inside my arm, a sound so unnatural it froze me for half a second before the searing pain made me collapse onto the floor, clutching at my elbow as if I could somehow hold myself together. Gasping for breath, trying not to choke on the taste of blood rising in my mouth, my body curling up instinctively while the man who was supposed to be my stepfather towered over me with a look of triumph carved into his face. Thomas Hayes had always carried himself like a man entitled to obedience, but that night he was more than entitled. He was savage, swinging the belt with a precision that told me this wasn't the first time he had used it on someone weaker. And behind him, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, was my mother, Linda. Not horrified, not broken, but smiling faintly like she had been waiting years to see me broken down at her feet, whispering coldly, "Rachel, you need to learn respect. You need to stop pretending this house is yours. This is Thomas's home now." Her voice cut sharper than the belt itself because hearing your own mother side with the man who is brutalizing you feels like being betrayed by the last person on earth who should have chosen anyone over you. And in that moment, I realized the truth. My mother had not just moved on from my father's death, she had erased him, erased the years of sacrifice he made, erased the promises he whispered on his deathbed that he wanted me to be safe in the home he built with his own hands. And now she was laughing quietly while her new husband shattered my arm like it was nothing. My vision blurred, but suddenly Linda stepped closer, holding something in her hand, and when my eyes adjusted, I saw the thin stack of papers, the pen clipped to the top, and she crouched just far enough to let me see the words at the top of the page. Deed Transfer Agreement, her voice chillingly calm. "Rachel, stop fighting us. Just sign. The pain will be over faster if you sign. We will let you stay if you accept Thomas as the owner, if you accept your place." She let one page fall, and the paper fluttered onto the carpet beside my face, and I watched as a drop of blood from my split lip stained the corner of the deed, the red soaking slowly into the fibers, and I thought to myself, this is what they want to see me broken enough to sign away everything my father left me while I'm lying in a pool of my own blood. Thomas leaned down, his breath sour with whiskey, his belt still clenched in his fist, and hissed, "Do it, sign it now, or next time it won't just be your arm." Somewhere in the hallway, Jake and Melissa laughed softly, enjoying the spectacle, and my mother's eyes glowed with something I had never seen before, a mix of cruelty and satisfaction, as if she believed forcing me to surrender on this floor would prove she had finally won. I pressed my lips together, my broken arm throbbing with every heartbeat, and forced myself to whisper through clenched teeth, "You just made a mistake, all of you, because you just beat the legal owner of this house and you think you can erase that with some blood-stained piece of paper. But you are wrong because this house is mine. My father left it to me, and if I have to crawl through hell to prove it, I will." For the first time that night, Thomas's smile faltered, and even Linda's smirk wavered, because deep down they both knew they could bruise my body. They could shove a pen into my good hand and demand my signature, but they could not erase the truth carved into that will or the fire that had just been lit inside me, a fire that would burn hotter than their lies, hotter than their greed, hotter than their cruelty. That night, as the blood dripped onto the deed they tried to force on me, I made a vow sharper than any blade that this was not the night I lost everything. This was the night I began taking it all back, piece by piece, until Thomas was rotting behind bars, until my mother faced the shame of siding with him, until Jake and Melissa were gone from my father's house forever, because if they wanted a war, they had just declared it, and they had no idea who they were really fighting. Before the night my stepfather tried to force a pen into my hand while my own blood dripped onto the deed, transfer my life had already been defined by a very different man. My father, Richard Sullivan, a man whose hands were calloused from decades of construction work, yet whose heart was steady enough to carry a family through storms that would have broken weaker men, and though he was gone, everything I was, everything I believed came from him. My father was not wealthy when he started. He was a craftsman in Seattle, who believed that integrity was worth more than shortcuts, that quality mattered more than flash, and he built his business one careful brick at a time, always saying, "Rachel, if you take care of the details, the big picture will take care of itself." While other contractors promised miracles and delivered excuses, my father told the truth, even when the truth cost him a contract, and people came to respect that. Not just clients, but workers. The men who stood beside him through long winters, the apprentices he trained with patience, the architects who trusted him because he never cut corners. By the time I was 10, his business was known across the city for taking the hardest restoration jobs. Old historic homes everyone else said were impossible to save, and he always told me, "Rachel, history matters, people matter. This work is not just about buildings, it is about preserving stories." Our own house was his masterpiece, a 2-story craftsman built in the 1920s, purchased with the earnings from his first big contract and lovingly renovated piece by piece, until every window, every plank of hardwood, every carved banister carried his touch, and he raised me inside those walls with lessons that went beyond carpentry or blueprints. Lessons about resilience, honesty, and the idea that a home is sacred, a fortress for those you love. When my mother Linda first met him, she was drawn to his certainty. The way he never wavered, and for years I thought they were strong. I thought love like theirs was unshakable. But after he died, I learned how fragile loyalty can be, how quickly devotion can be rewritten when it is no longer convenient. My father's health declined when I was in college. The long hours, the stress of keeping his workers employed during recessions, the endless paperwork, and he tried to brush it off as fatigue. But by the time the doctor said heart failure, it was too late. He passed suddenly at 59, leaving me and my mother in a silence that felt like a canyon. But here is the thing. My father was meticulous. He believed in planning for storms, and he left behind a will so detailed it was practically a roadmap to the future, with instructions, contingencies, and protections designed to safeguard me. In that will he gave the house to me outright. No conditions, no questions, along with the majority of his savings and investments. But he did something else, too. Something I did not fully understand until later. He established what he called the Community Heritage Fund, a trust linked to the house intended to support local restoration projects and scholarships for children of construction workers, and he named me the sole trustee, a role that would become far more important than I realized. He told me once before he died, "Rachel, the house is more than wood and glass. It is a symbol, it is the anchor for everything else, and as long as you hold it, no one can dismantle what we built." My mother nodded at the time, smiled even, but I remember a flicker in her eyes, a flicker I did not recognize until later, the flicker of someone who resented being left out of the command chain, someone who thought she deserved more. Still, I was too blinded by grief to notice, too focused on finishing my degree in software engineering and trying to hold on to my father's memory making weekly visits home. Cooking dinner for Mom, keeping the routines he had built alive, the Sunday afternoons on the porch, the evenings in the garage where his tools still hung perfectly labeled on the pegboard. When Linda first introduced me to Thomas Hayes, it was at a church luncheon 3 months after the funeral, and I remember thinking he seemed harmless enough, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, a handshake that lingered too long and a smile that did not reach his eyes. And though my instincts stirred uneasily, I told myself Mom deserved companionship, she deserved support, and I ignored the way his gaze lingered on the house more than on her. Within months, he was spending nights there. Within half a year, he moved in, and by then, I was living in an apartment across town, trying to balance a new job with my visits home, trying to believe this was just Mom finding comfort. But signs piled up, little by little, things disappearing. My father's old ledgers tossed out, the workshop reorganized without my permission. Then Thomas's son Jake started using the garage for his weightlifting equipment, casually selling off some of Dad's tools at a yard sale, like they were junk, and his daughter Melissa redecorated rooms without asking, painting over the warm earth tones my father loved with cheap gray. Every time I protested, Thomas would wave me off, saying, "You don't live here anymore." Rachel let us make it comfortable while Mom would sigh and tell me I was too attached to the past, that I needed to let go, that Dad was gone, and we needed to move forward. But the house was not just a building, it was the embodiment of everything my father had stood for. And when I saw Thomas lounging in his chair in the living room, the chair where Dad used to read to me when I was little, something inside me hardened. Still, I tried to compromise. I tried to keep peace until the day Thomas announced they were considering refinancing the house to fund a new project he wanted to invest in some vague real estate deal, and my stomach dropped because I knew then it was not just about Mom's loneliness or Thomas's presence. It was about money, power, and control. I went to the lawyer. My father had trusted David Miller and showed him the deed. The trust documents everything, and he reassured me, "Rachel, this house is yours. The trust is yours. They cannot touch it without your signature, but be careful because when people feel entitled, they will find ways to pressure you." I didn't know how right he was until the night the belt cracked, until the night my own mother knelt in front of me with papers stained by my blood, telling me to sign away my father's legacy. After the night of the belt and the blood-stained deed, nothing in the house was the same, though in truth, it had already been unraveling for months, perhaps years. And now every corner of the home that once felt like a sanctuary turned into a battlefield where Thomas asserted dominance. Linda reinforced his commands, and Jake and Melissa treated my father's legacy like a playground they could tear apart without consequence. I remember walking into the kitchen one morning, still nursing my broken arm in a sling, and finding the growth chart my father had carved into the doorframe, gone sanded down and painted over by Melissa, because, as she put it, no one cares about some old scratches. This kitchen needs to be modern, and I stood there staring at the smooth white paint where my childhood milestones had been recorded, feeling like someone had erased me from my own history. When I demanded an explanation, my mother snapped that I was being melodramatic, that I was letting grief make me selfish, and Thomas simply smirked, saying, "Rachel, you should thank us. We're increasing the value of this property with every improvement you'll see when you finally grow up and let go." He liked that phrase, let go. He used it every time I resisted, every time I reminded him and my mother that the deed was in my name, not theirs. And each time his voice grew harder, his threats sharper, until even the smallest disagreements felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with him shoving me closer to the drop. His son Jake, meanwhile, had claimed my father's garage, entirely stripping it of its pegboard organization, tossing boxes of hardware into the trash, selling off tools for beer money, and replacing the careful rows of wrenches and chisels with a crude weight bench and racks of dumbbells, blasting music loud enough to shake the windows, while he and his friends grunted through their workouts, laughing when I told them to leave, mocking me as if I were an intruder in my own home. Melissa was no better, treating the bedrooms as her personal design studio, painting walls in gaudy colors, stapling up string lights, tossing out antique furniture to make space for cheap store-bought pieces, and when I confronted her, she sneered that her father had promised this house would be theirs one day, that my mother agreed that I was clinging to a fantasy. The cruelty wasn't just in what they destroyed, but in the way they enjoyed watching me. Watch them do it. Like each broken piece of wood, each discarded heirloom was another lash of the belt across my back. I tried to spend less time there, telling myself distance would keep the peace, but the calls kept coming. Bills in my name for renovations I had never approved, threats that if I didn't pay, Thomas would take me to court for neglecting my responsibilities as the supposed owner. And every conversation with my mother became another layer of gaslighting, her voice, cold, accusing me of being ungrateful, of not respecting the man who had stepped up when my father died, of trying to hold on to the past at the expense of her happiness. I could almost accept her delusion if it was just about loneliness, but I saw the greed behind her eyes, the way she talked about Thomas's ideas about investments, about turning the house into something profitable, as if profit could replace love, as if money could rewrite the memories carved into every corner. The worst came one Sunday when I arrived unannounced and found contractors ripping out the built-in bookshelves my father had crafted with his own hands, the last project we had worked on together. Shelves where my mother once displayed her antique teacup collection, but now declared useless, dated ugly, and Thomas stood there directing the workers like he was the master of the estate, telling them to throw all that old wood into the dumpster, and when I screamed that they had no right, he turned to me, calmly, belt in hand, not raised but visible, and said, "Rachel, you're making a scene, and we all know what happens when you make a scene." My blood froze because I knew he meant it, and worse, I knew my mother would let him. That night, I met with David Miller again, showing him photos of the damage, the unauthorized renovations, the bills Thomas had sent me. And David shook his head grimly, saying, "They're pushing you, Rachel. They're trying to bait you into surrendering control, but legally you still hold all the cards. The problem is proving abuse, proving fraud, proving that they're not just tenants but predators." He warned me to keep records of everything, to photograph every change, to save every text and voicemail, because if this escalated, and it would, I would need evidence. I took his advice, but the escalation came faster than I imagined. Within weeks, Thomas was holding dinner gatherings in the dining room, inviting his church friends, telling them stories about how he was restoring his wife's house, how ungrateful her daughter was, painting me as a spoiled brat who wanted to keep my mother trapped in grief, and Linda would nod along, laughing at jokes made at my expense, her smile a mask that only slipped when she caught my eye, revealing a flash of bitterness of anger that I had not bent yet. Then came the bills for new flooring, new paint, a new security system registered under Thomas's name, all sent to me as if I were the one funding his empire. And when I refused to pay, he called me late at night, his voice slurred with drink, threatening that if I didn't cooperate, he'd make sure I never felt safe in that house again. It wasn't just threats either. One evening when I drove up the driveway, I found my tires slashed, my car disabled, and Jake leaning against the porch railing with a smirk, tossing the knife casually from hand to hand until I got out and he whispered, "Nice car, shame if something else happened to it." I called the police, but without proof, they shrugged it off as vandalism, advising me to file a report, and when I told David, he sighed. "Rachel, this is exactly what they want to intimidate you, to make you afraid enough to give them what they want." But I couldn't give in, not when every fiber of me screamed that this house, this legacy was worth fighting for. Still, their tactics grew bolder. One night, Linda herself called me, her voice honeyed, saying, "Rachel, you're tearing this family apart. You need to stop being so selfish if you love me. If you ever cared about me, you'll sign the papers." And when I told her no, she snapped, "If you don't, you'll regret it because Thomas isn't a man. You can keep waiting." That was the moment it hit me fully. She wasn't just tolerating him, she was his accomplice. She was the one feeding him my weak points, the one who handed me the deed with blood on it, the one who wanted me broken as much as he did. And then came the so-called intervention, a grotesque theater staged in my own living room, where Linda and Thomas invited relatives, neighbors, even the pastor, all of them sitting in a circle, telling me I was cruel, that I was dishonoring my father, by resisting, that I was letting stubbornness destroy my mother's chance at happiness. And when I tried to speak, they shouted me down, with Melissa crying about her pregnancy, clutching her stomach, saying stress was endangering her unborn child, with Jake shaking his head and saying I was heartless, with Linda weeping about how she had sacrificed everything for me only to be repaid with betrayal. It was a masterclass in manipulation, every guilt trip weaponized, every emotional string pulled, until even the pastor quoted scripture at me about honoring my mother. And for a moment, I almost faltered, almost believed I was the villain they painted me to be, until I remembered my father's letter tucked in my purse. The one he wrote, explaining exactly why he left the house to me, warning me that people might try to twist his intentions. I stood, then shaking my voice raw, and told them all, "This is my father's house. He left it to me, and I will not surrender it to liars, no matter how many tears you fake, no matter how many sermons you quote." Silence fell for a moment, but I saw the rage in Thomas's eyes, the calculation in Linda's, and I knew then this was far from over, that they would not stop until they broke me completely, and that if I wanted to survive, I would need more than words. I would need proof allies and the courage to turn their own weapons back on them. The night after the intervention, when my ears were still ringing from the chorus of voices condemning me, I sat alone in my apartment with my father's letter unfolded on the table, his handwriting steady, deliberate, reminding me that he had trusted me to protect not just the house, but the future it represented. And it was then that I noticed something I had overlooked before, a line about the Community Heritage Fund, a trust connected to the property meant to release grants for restoration and scholarships, but only if I remained the legal custodian of the house. And suddenly, the pieces clicked together. Thomas's obsession, Linda's insistence, the relentless push to get my signature. It wasn't just about living in the house. It was about unlocking that fund, a fund worth millions, money my father had earmarked for the community, but that Thomas and Linda planned to siphon off under the guise of renovations and investments. I took the documents to David Miller the next morning, and his eyebrows shot up as he flipped through them, murmuring, "This changes everything, Rachel. Because if they were trying to take control of this trust, we're not just dealing with domestic manipulation. We're dealing with fraud against a charitable foundation, and that is criminal." The weight of that word criminal lit a new fire inside me, because suddenly it wasn't just my bruises or my broken arm or the memories of the belt. It was proof that their greed reached beyond me, that they were willing to rob the community itself, and I swore I would not let them. David began compiling everything: photos, voicemails, bills, the attempted deed transfer. But he also advised me to stay alert to be ready because people like Thomas, when cornered, get desperate. He wasn't wrong. 2 nights later, as I pulled into the driveway to gather a few of my belongings still left in the house, the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Alvarez, a quiet woman who had known my father for decades, rushed over clutching her phone and whispered, "Rachel, you need to see this." And she showed me a video she had recorded through her window, shaky but clear enough. Thomas in the yard, belt in hand, dragging me across the floor the night of the beating. Linda standing in the doorway, smirking. Jake and Melissa laughing in the background, and the sight of it made my stomach twist. But Mrs. Alvarez's voice was firm. I didn't know what to do then, but I couldn't stay silent. "You need to use this." My hands trembled as I forwarded the file to David, who responded within minutes. "Rachel, this is gold. This is the evidence that ties everything together, not just their fraud, but their abuse. And once this is in front of a judge, the narrative shifts." But fate had other plans, because the next morning that same video somehow leaked, began circulating online, first on neighborhood forums, then on social media, spreading like wildfire. And suddenly the private hell they had inflicted on me was public strangers from across the city, commenting with outrage, demanding justice, calling Thomas a monster, calling my mother complicit, and for the first time in months, the tide turned in my favor. Thomas tried to control the story, calling me hysterical, claiming the video was taken out of context, that he had been disciplining me like any concerned father, but the internet wasn't buying it. The footage was too raw, too brutal, and the image of my mother smiling as I screamed was too damning. Reporters began calling, leaving messages asking for my side, and David urged me to stay quiet to let the legal process unfold, but the noise outside grew louder by the hour. Protesters showing up outside the house signs reading "Justice for Rachel Neighbors," whispering behind curtains, and Linda's perfect little facade began to crack. She called me one night, her voice shrill, demanding I release a statement saying the video was misleading, that I had provoked Thomas, and when I refused, she screamed, "Do you realize what you're doing to me? Do you realize you're destroying our reputation?" And I laughed bitterly, saying, "You destroyed yourself the moment you smiled while he broke my arm." Meanwhile, David uncovered more bank records showing Thomas had already funneled small amounts from the trust into shell accounts, invoices forged with Linda's signature, plans to liquidate assets under the guise of renovations. And the picture sharpened. They weren't just abusive, they were criminals planning a heist against my father's legacy. But just as I felt the walls closing in on them, they struck back with another kind of weapon. Whispers spread by Linda at church, and among relatives painting herself as a victim, claiming Thomas had manipulated her, that she had been helpless, that I was cruel for abandoning her. And some people believed it their pity for her, clouding their judgment, until suddenly I was fighting a battle on 2 fronts, one in the courts and one in the court of public opinion. The twist was bitter because while strangers online defended me, some of my own blood turned against me. Cousins calling to say I should forgive uncles muttering about family loyalty, and Linda playing the grieving widow reborn, the poor woman tricked by a bad man while conveniently ignoring the video of her smile. Still, the evidence piled up, and with David's guidance we prepared for court, ready to expose everything. But the final twist before the climax came the night Thomas himself showed up at my apartment, pounding on the door until I opened it to prevent a scene. His eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched, and he shoved a briefcase into my arms, snapping, "Sign these settlement papers. Rachel, take the money and walk away, or so help me, you'll regret it." And when I refused, he leaned close and whispered, You think the internet loves you now, but wait until they hear the real story. Wait until they hear what your precious father was hiding." My stomach dropped because his voice carried the weight of a threat I couldn't ignore, and when he stormed off, I called David immediately, and he confirmed my fear. They had found something in my father's old records, something they intended to weaponize to smear his name to make me question everything I thought I knew. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, but also desperation, because only guilty men threaten legacies when their own lives are about to unravel. And I knew then the climax was near. The storm my father had warned me about had finally arrived, and I would have to stand in its center armed with nothing but truth law and the fire that had carried me this far. The courthouse smelled of old paper and polished wood, and as I sat at the plaintiff's table with my arms still stiff from the fracture Thomas had given me, I could feel the weight of every eye in the room. Reporters lined along the benches, neighbors whispering in the back, and my mother, Linda, sitting beside Thomas with her lips pursed in a mask of calm that cracked only when she glanced at me, her eyes flickering with something between anger and fear. David Miller leaned toward me, his voice steady, saying, "Remember, Rachel, the truth is on our side. Let the evidence speak. Do not let them bait you." And I nodded even though my hands trembled beneath the table, because I knew this was not just a trial about property or money. It was about survival, about whether my father's name would stand or be dragged through mud, about whether the scars on my arm and the fire in my chest would mean something. The judge entered stern and gray-haired, and the proceedings began. The defense wasting no time trying to paint me as unstable, bitter, and ungrateful daughter who could not accept her mother's new life. And when their lawyer, a slick man in a tailored suit, gestured toward Linda and said she had only been trying to build a future after tragedy, I wanted to scream, but I forced myself to stay still, to breathe, to let David rise with his calm voice and lay out the facts, the deed, the trust, the video. When the video played on the screen, the sound of my scream echoing in the chamber, the crack of the belt, the snap of bone, and my mother's faint smile visible in the corner, the room went silent. Reporters scribbling furiously, jurors shifting uncomfortably, the judge's jaw tightening, and I watched Thomas's face pale for the first time since this nightmare began. Linda reached for his hand, but he pulled away, his mask faltering, and I thought, this is it. This is the moment the world sees them for who they are. But then their lawyer stood, his voice smooth, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, you must understand context." Thomas was disciplining his stepdaughter after repeated outbursts. It was not malicious, and as for the so-called deed, we have evidence that Rachel's father Richard was not the saint. She claims evidence of financial misconduct, and suddenly he held up a stack of papers, my heart plunging into my stomach as he said, "Richard Sullivan laundered money through his construction business, money that funded this very house. Money that taints every claim Rachel makes." Gasps rippled through the room, reporters scribbling faster, and I felt dizzy, betrayed by shadows of a past I had never seen. But David was ready, standing firm, saying, "Objection, Your Honor. These documents are irrelevant and unverified," and the judge frowned, demanding the defense explain their source. The lawyer stammered slightly, claiming anonymous informants' financial irregularities, but David cut him off. Pulling out our own investigators' report pages of verified accounts audits, proof that my father's finances had been clean, that the so-called irregularities were manipulated copies forged by Thomas's associates. And when David spread the originals across the table, the contrast was clear. My father's signature authentic and steady, the forgeries sloppy beneath scrutiny, and I felt a surge of pride, of relief, knowing they had tried to poison his name and failed. The jury looked unsettled, their sympathy shifting back toward me, and David pressed the attack, revealing the shell accounts Thomas had opened, the invoices Linda had signed, the fraudulent plans to divert the Community Heritage Fund, the very documents David had uncovered. And as he spoke, the weight of the evidence stacked higher and higher until it felt like a tower ready to topple on their heads. But the climax did not end in the courtroom. It spilled into the streets outside, where cameras flashed and microphones crowded as I left each day, reporters calling my name, asking how it felt to face my own mother, asking if I could forgive, and my answer was always the same. Forgiveness is not possible without accountability, and right now accountability is all that matters. The public devoured every update the video shared, millions of times talk shows dissecting my story, advocacy groups reaching out to me, and I became a reluctant symbol, not just a daughter fighting for her father's house, but a survivor standing against abuse. And though the pressure was immense, it gave me strength because I knew I was not alone anymore. Still, Linda fought with every ounce of cunning she had, taking the stand and weeping about how Thomas had manipulated her, about how she had been blind, about how she loved me. But I had turned against her, and for a moment, her performance swayed some hearts. But then David played the second video. Mrs. Alvarez had captured the one where Linda herself pressed the deed into my hand, urging me to sign while I bled on the carpet, her voice calm and cold, and the mask shattered her tears, exposed as lies, her pleas hollow. The jury's faces hardened, the judge's patience waned, and I watched my mother sink into her chair, realizing the persona she had built was collapsing in real time. Then came Thomas's turn, his arrogance bleeding through as he snarled on the stand, insisting he had done nothing wrong, that I was weak, that discipline was necessary. But when David pressed him about the shell accounts, his voice cracked, his anger boiling, and finally he shouted, "She deserved it! She was standing in the way of what was ours!" And the courtroom gasped, because in that one slip he revealed everything, the greed, the entitlement, the truth, that it had never been about family or discipline. It had always been about control. The prosecution rested, the defense sputtered, and when the jury left to deliberate, I sat trembling, my mind replaying every moment, every lash, every betrayal, and wondering if they would see the truth. Hours later, they returned their verdict, clear, guilty of fraud, guilty of assault, guilty of attempted coercion, and as the judge read the sentence, Thomas's face drained of color. Linda's shoulders slumped, and I felt a wave of something fierce and cleansing wash through me. Reporters erupted outside headlines screaming justice, and for the first time in months, I breathed without the weight of fear on my chest. But the climax was not just legal, it was personal, because that night after the verdict, as I stood on the porch of the house my father built, reporters still camped on the sidewalk. I looked at the front door and realized the war was over, that the house was truly mine again, not just in name, but in spirit, and I whispered to the empty rooms, "Dad, I did it, I kept your promise." Yet even in victory the scars ached, the memories lingered, and I knew the story was not done. Because though the law had spoken, the world outside still debated, still gossiped, still watched, and my mother, ever manipulative, was already shifting into her next mask, already preparing her next play. And I braced myself because the aftermath was coming, and sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought not in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion. The courtroom verdict had been decisive, the headlines triumphant, and the cameras caught me walking out with David at my side, a survivor who had faced her abusers and won. Yet even as the cheers of supporters echoed in the background, I could feel the shifting undercurrent, the way my mother Linda's face reappeared on television screens only days later, framed not as the guilty accomplice who had pressed a bloody deed into her daughter's hands, but as a grieving woman caught in a storm too big for her to control. She sat with carefully chosen reporters, her voice trembling, saying she had been manipulated by Thomas, that she was afraid of him, that she had smiled that night in the video only because she was terrified of what he would do to her if she showed weakness. And though I knew the truth, though the jury had seen her coldness for what it was, the narrative began to fracture as some people pitied her. Some whispered that perhaps she was a victim too. And suddenly, the battle I thought I had won was no longer just about the law. It was about perception, about who the public believed. I remember standing in the grocery store as strangers debated near me, one woman saying, "That poor mother, she looks broken," while another shook her head, muttering. She smiled while her daughter screamed, "Don't forget that!" And I realized this would not end with the gavel, it would bleed into every corner of our lives. Linda leaned into that sympathy, sending letters to church members asking for prayers, painting herself as a woman abandoned by her daughter in her hour of need. And some believed her family friends, who called me with sharp voices demanding I show compassion, asking how I could be so unforgiving while online. The comments warred, half praising me, half accusing me of vengeance. It was a cruel twist because while Thomas sat in a cell awaiting sentencing, Linda walked free on bail and she wielded that freedom to rebuild her image to chip away at mine. And though the evidence was public, though the court had ruled the world outside, did not move on so easily. I felt the exhaustion seep into my bones, the endless questions from reporters, the messages from strangers, the hate mail calling me a monster for letting my own mother be destroyed. And at night, I lay awake wondering if I had inherited not just my father's strength, but his stubbornness, if holding the line was worth being painted as cold. But then I would remember his voice, his steady hands guiding mine on the saw, his words. Integrity is about doing the right thing even when it hurts, and I would rise in the morning and face it all again. David advised me to ignore the noise to focus on rebuilding, but the noise became impossible to ignore when Linda requested supervised visitation, not for reconciliation, but for optics, showing up with her lawyer and crocodile tears telling the judge she only wanted to see me to make amends. But when the motion was denied, she stepped outside the courthouse and turned on the cameras crying that her daughter had turned her back, and once again, the sympathy tilted. That was when I decided silence was no longer protection, it was surrender. So I accepted an invitation from a national network, sat in a studio with lights blazing, and told my story from the beginning. Every bruise, every scream, every manipulation, and I ended with the words, "Forgiveness without accountability is not healing. It is permission for abuse, and I will not give that permission, not even to my mother." The interview spread shared as widely as the original video. And though it reignited the storm, it also gave others courage. Women and men writing to me saying they had faced similar betrayals, that my refusal to cave gave them strength. And for the first time, I felt the scales tip not toward pity for Linda, but toward recognition of a larger truth that abuse does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people who should love you most. Still, the aftermath was messy family, fractured beyond repair. Cousins refusing to speak to me, old neighbors crossing the street rather than meet my eye. But I understood now that being cast as the villain in their story did not make me wrong. It only proved how deeply manipulation can run. Linda continued her campaign writing open letters playing the frail widow, and though some bought it, many did not. The memory of that smile burned too deeply into the public consciousness. I focused instead on restoration, not just of the house, but of myself, hiring craftsmen my father once trusted to repair the shelves, to strip away the cheap paint, to bring back the woodwork Thomas had tried to erase. And every nail hammered back into place felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. But the post-climax was not only about the house. It was about the new role I had been thrust into, advocates calling me to speak at events, to share my story, as a warning to remind others that abuse does not always wear the face of a stranger. And though I was reluctant, I agreed because silence had cost me enough. Each time I stood before an audience, my mother's face haunted me, her voice whispering guilt, but I spoke anyway, telling the truth because I had learned the hard way that truth spoken aloud has the power to shatter lies. And so, even as Linda tried to rebuild herself as the tragic mother wronged by a bitter daughter, the truth stood taller, louder, until the scales tipped for good, and I realized that while the court had given me justice, it was my voice that gave me freedom. 6 months after the verdict, the house finally felt like mine again. Not just on paper, not just in legal declarations, but in the quiet of early mornings when sunlight touched the hardwood floors my father once sanded by hand, the same floors Thomas had tried to cover with vinyl, and I would stand there barefoot, breathing deeply and remembering that survival is not just about outlasting the storm. It is about reclaiming the air afterward. The restoration had been long, and exhausting craftsmen who had worked with my father returned, one by one, offering their time, sometimes refusing payment, saying, "Richard gave me my start. This is how I honor him," and with every shelf rebuilt, every beam polished, every detail returned to its original integrity, I felt his presence steadying me, telling me I had done what he hoped I would do. Outside, the world still whispered. Linda gave interviews from time to time. Some people pitied her, still saying she had been manipulated, but the image of her smile in that video never fully faded. And when the sentencing came down, Thomas received 10 years for fraud and abuse. while Linda received probation and fines along with public disgrace. And though the punishment felt lighter than the pain she inflicted, I understood that her true sentence was living every day in the shadow of what she had chosen to be exposed, not as a grieving widow, but as a mother who had smiled at her daughter's suffering. Jake disappeared into obscurity, leaving town after being charged for vandalism and petty theft. Melissa gave birth to her child and posted sentimental photos online, trying to craft a narrative of resilience. But even those who once defended her could not look at her without remembering the laughter in her voice as she watched me on the floor that night. My family remained fractured. Some cousins refused to speak to me. Others quietly reached out to apologize, saying they had been deceived by Linda's tears. But by then, I no longer needed their validation. I had learned that family is not determined by blood, but by who stands beside you when the darkness closes in. David Miller became more than my attorney. He became a mentor, reminding me that law is not just about winning cases. It is about drawing boundaries between what people can take and what they cannot. And I found myself drawn to advocacy, speaking at community centers, at universities, at conferences, about inheritance, abuse, elder fraud, and domestic violence, because I realized my story was not just mine. It was a mirror for countless others who had been silenced. One night, after a speaking event, a woman in her 70s approached me, tears in her eyes, and said, "Rachel, I thought I was alone. My son tried to take my house and no one believed me. But when I saw your story, I knew I wasn't crazy, and that was when I understood the true meaning of what I had endured, that my scars were not just reminders of pain. They were signals to others that survival was possible." The Community Heritage Fund, which Thomas and Linda had tried to steal, flourished under my trusteeship scholarships awarded to children of construction workers grants given to restore historic buildings, and in every ceremony I would speak my father's name, reminding the world that integrity outlives cruelty. The house became more than my refuge. It became a community symbol open to tours during Heritage Weeks, students walking through rooms learning about craftsmanship, preservation, and resilience. And every time someone marveled at the shelves or the woodwork, I would smile, knowing those pieces had nearly been lost, but were saved because I refused to sign a paper stained with my own blood. The public fascination eventually faded, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies, but the foundation remained and my voice grew stronger, more confident, until even the whispers about Linda could not touch me anymore because I had built something louder, something lasting. On the 1-year anniversary of the verdict, I stood on the porch with a glass of wine, looking at the neighborhood children playing in the yard, the same yard where Thomas once threatened me, and I felt no fear, only gratitude that the cycle had been broken, that the house had returned to being what my father intended, a sanctuary, not a battlefield. I thought about Linda, sometimes wondered if she regretted, wondered if she replayed that night in her mind. But I never answered her letters, never took her calls, because some wounds do not close with apologies. Some betrayals are too deep, and forgiveness would not heal me. It would only reopen scars. Instead, I chose to forgive myself for the nights I thought I was weak, for the times I almost believed their lies, for the moments I doubted my worth. And in forgiving myself, I found peace. Thomas remained in prison, his appeals denied his name, forgotten except in legal documents and whispered cautionary tales. Linda faded into the background, her church attendance dwindling her friends, scattering her face lined not by age alone, but by the weight of choices she could not undo. And that was enough for me. Justice not in vengeance, but in consequences that echoed every day of their lives. My story was eventually adapted into a documentary, the producers careful to honor the truth, to highlight not just the abuse but the resilience, and I agreed to participate only on one condition: that the profits support shelters and advocacy programs. And when I sat in the theater months later watching my own screams replayed on screen, I did not feel shame. I felt power, because the image that once haunted me now inspired others. In the quiet of night, I often walked into the art studio I had built from what Thomas once wanted to turn into his wine cellar, the walls bright with canvases splashed with color, my hands steady with a brush instead of trembling from fear, and I painted not just my face, but visions of firelight breaking darkness, of hands gripping tools, of a house standing tall through storms, because that was the story I wanted to leave behind. When people asked me later what the lesson was, what I had learned through it all, I would answer simply that blood may betray love, may rot, but integrity survives if you fight for it, and that sometimes justice is not the sound of a gavel, but the silence of walking barefoot across floors your father built knowing they are still yours. And as the years passed, the scars on my arm faded, but the strength inside me grew until I no longer thought of myself as the daughter who was beaten, the girl who bled on a deed, but as the woman who turned betrayal into legacy, who refused to be erased, who rebuilt not just a house, but a life on her own terms. That was my ending, not tied with forgiveness, not softened with reconciliation, but sharpened with truth. A truth strong enough to outlast lies and bright enough to guide others through their own darkness. Because if I learned anything, it was this: the best revenge is not rage or ruin. It is building something beautiful where they tried to leave you broken and standing tall in the house they thought they had stolen, whispering into the silence I won. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it struck a chord with you, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it, because stories like these aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that justice can prevail even against family betrayal. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone stand up to abuse or manipulation in your own family or community? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters more than you think.